our third and final speaker for this session, Caroline.
Okay. I'm standing between you and the end of the day, so can you hear me? All right. I don't quite know how I'm going to organize all of this. I'm going to speak about our work to support the implementation of policies that implement integrated water resource management. And I'm specifically going to focus on collaborative partnerships as a mechanism for doing that, and how they can mobilize finance, but also extension capacity at a local level. Now, one of the things that emerged after democracy was our New Water Act. And one of the things that it brought up was the idea of collaborative governance at a local level. And the initial idea was that we would have 19 catchment management agencies in each of the 19 water management areas, and that these would help devolve catchment management to a local level. However, 25 years later, they still aren't fully rolled out, and the number has been decreased till 6. And as a consequence, there is a challenge in terms of collaborative governance at a catchment scale. And another thing that happened was that catchment management was identified as one of the things that those catchment management agencies had to do. But there was no mechanism which ensured that catchment management agencies actually had to budget or implement catchment management. So there was a vacuum. And as a result, the financing often came from other parts of the fiscus, which made it financially unstable and meant that it was very difficult to apply user pays principles. So my colleagues from South Africa have outlined some of the challenges that we have. We have half the average global water supply. We're sitting on 98% of our water already allocated. And the prediction is that as a result of climate change and also the need to address our serious inequalities, for example, only 5% of our agricultural water currently goes to Black farmers, that there will be a 17% deficit in our water supply by 2030. That's not very far away. And what is aggravating that as well is that water and sanitation is not available for 14 million people. But even those who do have sanitation services, a lot of the wastewater treatment plants, over 50%, aren't actually functioning properly. And our power crisis is exacerbating that impact, and that is impacting also in terms of our water quality issues. And that has been exacerbated by the fact that we're continuing to lose, as in the rest of the world, our wetlands and rivers, which could have buffered them very rapidly. So we have recognized we have a power crisis, but there's also been recognized recently that we have a water crisis looming as a result of lack of investment in water infrastructure. And a 33 billion rand annual funding gap has been acknowledged by the Department of Water and Sanitation. But the challenge is that that is only budgeting for the revenue needed to manage the built infrastructure. We're not even beginning to talk about managing the catchments. And they have decided that they would do that by providing additional funding resources from the fiscus, but also increasing revenue as well from increasing water tariffs and by reducing non-revenue water. We lose up to 35% of our processed water in leaks. We simply can't afford that. So when I'm talking about ecological infrastructure, as I mentioned in the field trip before, we're talking about healthy catchments. So you can put in all the dams and pipelines that you like, but if your catchments are degraded, you're not going to have water and you're not going to have clean water. So we do need to invest in our ecological infrastructure along with our grey infrastructure or built infrastructure. And even though many of our catchment areas are rural, we still are experiencing degradation as a result of overgrazing, poor agricultural practices, or invasion by invasive alien plants. And that is having a significant impact on the quality and the quantity of the water. And those impacts are increasing, and we simply can't afford those increases, especially in view of the fact that we're sitting at 98% of inequitably distributed water, and we're facing climate change as well. We simply have to to make a change in terms of how we manage our catchments. And what the invasive alien plants do is they impact the water quantity and they impact the assurance of supply. So we spoke about the fact that they really decrease the assurance of the supply. And so I'm going to dive a little bit more deeply into what I actually am meaning in terms of the invasive alien plants. So they use up to 30% of the average water flow coming off our catchments, and that's bad enough. But they lose up to 60% of the water in droughts or in your dry seasons. So when we're standing in buckets in the shower in order to be able to flush our toilets or wash our clothes, it's 60% of that water is being taken by invasive alien plants. So that's an enormous loss. And the city of Cape Town recognized that, and they are consequently investing 25 million per year in restoring their catchments. Now that's coming from the general fiscus rather than their water tariffs, which we'd prefer because that would be more sustainable, but it still is a very good start in terms of a nature-based solution. And I think the important thing that we have to recognize is that these nature-based solutions, apart from fixing leaks, is the most cost-effective way of producing water. It's a fraction of the cost of building new dams, desalinization, any of the other high-tech options. And the important thing to recognize as well is that they also have co-benefits. It creates jobs. So in that catchment that we saw in the field trip yesterday, there are 30 people who are employed in order to clear that catchment. And it's also benefiting biodiversity. That catchment is a provincial nature reserve, and a result of the provincial nature reserve being saddled with the cost of managing the cost of managing those catchments and not being paid for it, they actually have about 10% of the budget that they need to manage those catchments. And so they can't. And then the consequence is that you have this degradation in ecosystem services and also in biodiversity, because they simply can't subsidize the water sector's responsibility. So although these clearing programs are very cost effective, they still do cost a lot of money. And so we can't spread our effort evenly throughout the country. So what we did is we undertook a prioritization exercise together with WRC and the Council for Scientific Industrial Research. And we identified 10% of South Africa, which produces over 50% of the water. And we said, okay, this is the area where we need to focus. And these were identified as strategic water source areas. And they were identified as being of national importance. And everybody agreed that we had to prioritize this. So the first step was that identification process where we identified where these strategic water source areas were. And then there was a period of 10 years of intensively engaging with the government authorities. And then those policies and recognition of the strategic water source areas began being taken up into the water policy frameworks. And so that was a good start. And then we did a legal review to see which of the national policies could be used to protect the strategic water source areas. And then the next step was further uptake into the water policies. And then very excitingly, it started being taken up into broader national policies. So it's now part of the National Spatial Development Framework, and also the medium-term strategic MTSF. I can't remember, I'm bad with acronyms. Anyway, it's what's used to direct all government spending. And because it's been identified as a national priority under that framework, the Auditor General now tracks whether or not these strategic water source areas are being secured. And let me tell you, that really helps get uptake when the Auditor General is asking whether this is being done. And so the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment created a body that was mandated to implement this. And so WWF has been working with that body to identify the mechanisms that can be used to secure these strategic water source areas. And we identified 3 different types of mechanisms. The first are the enabling mechanisms, and those are the legal and policy frameworks and financing mechanisms that enable the operational work in the ground, which are the implementation mechanisms. And then we recognize also that there needs to be reflective mechanisms which share learning locally and ensure that there's improvement in approaches that we apply. And I need to wake you all up. Can see there's fading in the room. So how do we actually have these strategic water source areas implemented? You know, it's a very nice idea in theory, but how do we actually get people mobilized behind it? So we are developing multi-sector and multi-scale water source partnerships. We're working with local, provincial, and national government across all different sectors in each of these 9 strategic water source areas. And these were prioritized in terms of their importance according to a very complicated prioritization process. But a lot of it was around how much of the economy is dependent on these areas. And so what these water source partnerships do is that they amplify potential for policy coherence between different government institutions, but they also provide a local forum where you can deal with a problem where there is local incoherence or there's trade-offs needed to be made. So it makes a very practical place. You know, we all talk about this collaborative governance. How do you actually do it? It provides opportunities for mentorship, and also you can feed up into policy. And so what WWF has been doing in these water source partnerships is supporting the process of convening them and building them. And our role varies in different places, and that requires a bit of flexibility. We also support collaborative planning, and for that you need to have convening skills. And so our staff get special training. We also provide that to key partners. And an important part is blending finance, both from government and the private sector, to make sure that government funding for this kind of thing tends to be very stop-start, unfortunately, because it's not linked to water tariffs. And so there's a need for bringing in private sector funding to smooth that out. And then we are linking that to cross-sectoral work. And so the one thing is that everybody agrees that collaborative governance is needed, but everybody wants to fund projects. They don't want to actually fund the kind of grunt work of collaborative governance. So, you know, that is something which is really underestimated, although it's important. And it's really important that those partnerships stay in play. You don't want to have something coming in place and withdrawing, because that actually creates further resistance. If you try and come in afterwards, people are annoyed. You came in and you left. And this has to be really deeply owned by the government institutions. So we aim to build capacity in the mandated authorities. The second thing is to bring in that private sector and government to support government. And some of our private sector funders are supporting this governance work. And that includes financiers, but also corporate partners. So they are coming on board, being part of those partnerships, but also supporting some of that very important partnership work. And then we try to place people in mandated authorities, mentor them, and make sure that there's really deep uptake within authorities. But the partnerships are not enough. You need to actually have capacitated people, extension on the ground. That's really how you get traction. And the one key thing that we found is that you can't have somebody coming in with only one sector's expertise. They need to have some understanding of the other sectors, together with a skill of managing the finance, reporting to donors, and also being able to convene different sectors. So I call them supermen and superwomen, because we really ask it all of them. And they need to ideally come from and be embedded in and live in the communities. And you don't want them coming in and out of the situation. They need to become a trusted partner. That's really important in terms of uptake. So we've got quite a few in the strategic water source area that you visited yesterday, and they mobilize local action, and they leverage a lot of additional resources. So, you know, they leverage a lot of other funding, and they help manage it to make sure that it's spent effectively. And a very important part of this is to work across different sectors. In the past, extension work in South Africa, as in many other places, was often thought to be focused around agriculture. But actually the same kind of process of interactive engagement with land users and landowners occurs in the conservation sector, forestry, fisheries, water sector. And so there's been increasing awareness that one needs to build that cross-sectoral approach to extension, so that you have somebody who's more like a general practitioner who screens initial problems on a farm and then refers people to specialists when needed. we have so few extension officers. On average, about 11% of farmers even ever see an extension officer ever. And mostly those are funded by fertilizer and feed companies. So we just really need to mobilize more extension and to get them working more collaboratively with each other. So in addition to the local platforms, we established a national community of practice to support better training for extension and to strengthen the sustainability of the collaborative platforms that I spoke about, and then to deploy people in the area. And I can see that there's a lot of material on training for sustainable extension, and I'd really like it if you could send me material on that. We're wanting to strengthen the training. We're seeing that a lot of agricultural extension, for example, is not including the new regenerative techniques. We've been reviewing their syllabi and is not including issues around climate change. And many of the old people in field did their training before this emerged. So we need to kind of do retroactive training with them. And the older people in the field are more valuable than the younger ones sometimes, because often the extension is seen as an entry level position, but actually wisdom, can build with age. An important factor, I know I'm running into time here, is that the government is losing 1.3 billion rand because of the subsidies every year, and they've decided to remove the pricing caps on agriculture and forestry. That's going to be very, very explosive politically, but they've decided that they're going to do that. There's going to need to be transition finance to help people move to more effective water stewardship, because the thing is that as soon as water becomes more expensive, then those more effective technologies become more durable from a price perspective. And they are going to continue to protect the vulnerable farmers for about 10, 15 years, so that it will be a phased-in process, especially for the new area farmers. And the local survey has shown that people are willing to pay. And we've worked out that for catchment management fees, we only need about 1.5 to 2.5% increase on the water tariffs. So it's not a lot on the total water tariffs. So the catchment management agencies are currently, as I said before, not budgeting for the catchment management, and we need to bring them on board. And there's these massive additional benefits. We need to recognize that there's a dependency on ecological infrastructure. Treasury has recognized in principle that there's cross-subsidization, and also have said in principle we can use both infrastructure finance for ecological infrastructure, but we need to create precedents. And this is my final slide, you'll be happy to hear. So just to summarize, we need to identify the priority areas. We need to work in them through partnerships. We need to establish plans, and then we need to blend finance from different sources. And that needs to be mobilized by local coordinators who really come from and are embedded in the community. Thank you.
Let's take a couple minutes for maybe 2 questions maximum. Then we have a coffee break. Then we'll come back and have a brief Q&A and set of reflections for the full panel. I think you want to stay up here for maybe 2 questions. I think so. Well, it's still fresh on people's minds.
I'm happy to give everyone else.
Please. Sylvester, please.
Thank you very much for an interesting presentation. I think you didn't highlight the fact that South Africa has got very good policies, plans, and strategies.
Yeah.
The biggest problem is the implementation.
Exactly.
And there's no harmonization of those policies. I'll give you an example. If I'm a minister of water and sanitation today, and then 3 months down the line, I'm fired, then there's a new minister. That minister is not going to continue with my program of action.
Exactly.
He or she will start with a new program.
Yeah.
And when we developed the National Development Plan, one of the objectives was to make sure that there's continuity in whatever program that the government has developed. This thing is creating problems for us, and that is why we'll continue with this silo mentality of running things. The water sector will run its own activities, energy, and so on. There must be some sort of proper coordination I liked some of the suggestions that you have highlighted. I would advise you, or I mean, I will contact you so that, I mean, you share some of your ideas with the National Planning Commission, because that forum is sort of a think tank, and they are very close to the president in order to try to make things happen.
Exactly.
Thanks for that,
That's
but
really-
let's work outside this forum.
Good.
Final question, please.
I think I also asked this for the benefit of what I just presented on. You mentioned that there is a willingness to pay by who? Is it by the big corporates? Is it by
No.
the communities? And
Yeah.
also, is there also capacity for proper collection of tariffs in the city,
Yeah.
or from those big corporates? Because, for example, in the water space where we operate, it's always an issue of non-cost reflective tariffs. Either cannot collect them, or there's not willingness for people to understand the concept of user pay principles. Do they fully understand in this
Yeah.
city that they need to pay for that benefit or that ecological service?
Yeah, so the willingness to pay was done in the, I think it was the Home Affairs Department, so they were able to get a cross-section of everybody who was a victim of the queue, and did a survey of them. But in general, the large corporates are paying their fees, but there's a lot of non-revenue water collection, and that is one of the things that the catchment management agencies is focusing on. So when I'm saying that they're not doing the catchment management, it's not because they're not doing any work. They're focusing on trying to secure that revenue, and with the budget that they've got, that's what they can manage to do. So there's reasons for why we're sitting there. But I think people have experienced, and they know that we are a water scarce country, and that what we need to look after our water carefully. And I think especially also after the power crisis that we've had, there's an acknowledgement that we have to invest in water infrastructure to secure our water supply, that we can't afford to have water insecurity in the same way that we're currently experiencing energy insecurity.
Back for a final discussion. Here we go. I mean, they're already 5 minutes out.